Hi, good afternoon. Sorry, is that too loud? Welcome. I just wanted to introduce our speaker tonight. First, I wanted to let you know that I'm a Scrum Master here for the Dart Rich Media and Video teams, and I have been for a little over 2 years. My name is Amy Dekowitz. Our teams have really benefited from the Scrum process. It's helped us to focus on team collaboration and increase productivity. So we're very excited to be able to host Dr. Jeff Sutherland for this talk today. Not sure how many people are using Pure Scrum or maybe just applying some of the practices that Scrum teaches us, but I have a feeling that many people in this room have distributed teams and are probably very familiar with the challenges that those present to us. So I'm very much looking forward, and I think it'll probably be very meaningful to everybody here to hear some of the insights and some of the suggestions from Dr. Sutherland about how we can overcome some of these challenges and develop our teams when we have people in multiple locations. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Jeff Sutherland.
Thank you. Well, we're here tonight to talk about pretty good Scrum. You know, there's a lot of Scrum out there, and some of it is great Scrum, and some of it is okay Scrum, some of it's pretty good Scrum, and some of it is what we call Scrum butt. Unfortunately, there's a lot of Scrum butt out there. You know, we're doing Scrum butt. We left out this because, you know, it's like we're doing object-oriented programming, but, you know, inheritance was hard for us, so we just left that out, and you know, all these other things that might be difficult in objects. We'll just take our C procedures and compile them in a C++ compiler. We'll call that objects, okay? Unfortunately, when you, like in the Stillbrook cartoon, recently I was working with a large consultancy in the Microsoft area and out in Redmond, and they had visited a company who said they were doing XP, and they said, well, are you doing pair programming? No, we're not doing that. Well, how about continuous integration? No, we're not doing that. Well, they went through every XP process or engineering practice. And they said, well, what are you doing? They said, well, we're doing no documentation. That's Agile. Well, the thing why that's important is that it has a significant impact on the ability to deliver high-quality software. So one of the things that they came up with at Nokia, I'm going to spend some time talking about that tonight. Bas Vode, who is the Nokia trainer, Scrum trainer in Finland for many years, trained hundreds of Scrum teams, came up with this little test to see, you know, I need a checklist. Are these people that's in Nokia doing Scrum, or are they just doing Scrum butt? And I'm going to talk later about exactly what the Nokia test is, but recently, one of the guys did a survey on who's doing the Nokia test, and there are 8 questions in the test. And he found that 74% of the teams were not doing all 8. So he concluded that 74% of the Scrum teams in the world are Scrum butt. So we're going to find out maybe tonight how many people in here are doing Scrum butt. How many people are doing Scrum in here? A lot of you, okay? So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, here's why Scrum butt is important. If you do an excellent Scrum, you might be pumping up your revenue 400% every year. If you're doing good Scrum, maybe it's only going up 300%. If you're doing pretty good Scrum, it's going up 160 to 200%. I gave a couple of examples. Even Google fits in that category. But if you're doing Scrum butt, you know, it's improving, but it's not worth writing home about, okay? So how many people want to move beyond Scrum butt in here? Okay, most of you are doing Scrum. So we're going to talk about what people are doing to move beyond that. Now, one of the things that's happened in recent years is I do a lot of work with Jim Copley. And Jim Copley was at Bell Labs. He ran the Pasteur project. He wrote hundreds of case studies on best projects. He has a very interesting book on Agile organizational patterns. We're starting to do research on that, on Scrum teams in Europe. And, you know, he complains that, a lot of these data points that we look at are really applications that maybe the quality wasn't so good, maybe they failed, it's only one data point, it's not really research. And I had to give this talk in Sweden, and he was going to be there. Actually, he was the keynote, so I had to answer all his questions in the talk. So I'm going to go through some of the thinking behind some of the numbers that I'm always talking about. It's interesting that extreme data points often unsustainable. For example, the Borland QuattroPro project delivered 1,000 lines of C++ code per developer per week for 3 years running. So they delivered millions of lines of code at a rate that's never been equaled. At least nobody's ever documented that they can equal it. And compare that to the Windows Vista team that delivered 1,000 lines of C++ code per developer per year. So the 8 people at Borland delivered as much as 400 Windows developers. That's a pretty big difference. So we're talking about differences that are not little differences. They're like huge differences, order of magnitude differences between teams. Now, the Borland project, it failed. Microsoft crushed them. So is it worth looking at if it's a failed project? Another interesting project I'll talk a little bit about was the Suzy Dynamics project, which was half in St. Petersburg, Russia, and half in the US and Canada. And this was the most highly productive team ever documented that delivered a system over 1 million lines of code. And they did it at a rate that a high-performing 6-person Scrum team co-located in one room delivers code. So at a rate almost an order of magnitude greater than industry average for a distributed team. Now, that project had quality problems. There were some management problems. It was started by the Dynamics company, which was acquired by Cersei Dynamics. Cersei Dynamics had a competitive product. They did deploy it into the market, but a new implementation, the customer always wants more features. So they had problems there, plus this competitive project. They finally just killed the project. So another failed project, another extreme data point that failed. So the question is that of any use to us, looking at an extreme data point that failed? Another fascinating example is from Motorola. David Anderson, who was at Motorola, then went to Microsoft, has a complete data set on the second most productive team in the world that's ever been documented. He never wrote a case study on it. One of the problems was that when they completed the project, Motorola decided, the marketing guys decided that they wouldn't even use the product. They bought a third-party solution. And in the sprints that followed, Motorola started inserting bureaucracy on top of the team that required all this extensive reporting, all this non-agile stuff, and the best guys in the team bailed out. So here's a team that was an extreme data point, but died. It was like crib death, It just went away instantaneously because of, they didn't feed the baby. They just let it die in the crib. So is that a data point worth working at? I have complete data on that. Many Excel spreadsheets, thousands of data points. I'm wondering, should we write up a case study on that? I don't know. It's really useful to look at why some of these teams were extremely helpful. But the basic question is, can failure help us? Okay. And I argue that it can. That it takes a lot of failures to produce something great. And in fact, the whole operation of a company like Toyota or Honda is predicated on failing as many times as possible, as fast as possible, in order to rise to a level of performance and capability that's way beyond the norm. It's kind of like training for the Olympic team. I remember I was trained, when I was at West Point, I was training under an Olympic coach. Our coach was the Olympic coach the years I was there. And so I had the assistant coach were Olympic team members. So I was a parallel bars guy, so I would come in every afternoon for 3 hours. I get up in the parallel bars, I do a flip, and the the coach would say, it's not quite right, get up and do it again. And for 3 years, for 3 hours every day, even some weekends, it was never right. And every once in a while, just to show me it was not right, he would get up and do a perfect one, just to rub it in. Okay, but I tell you, at the end of those 3 years, I could do it better than most of the people that we were competing with, okay? So it's that constant failing and retrying and trying to reach for a higher level that takes people places where no one ever has gone before. It's one of the reasons that Toyota is winning. Like, a good example is you listen to the chairmen of the board at Toyota. There's an excellent article in the Harvard Business Review in June last month called something like the contradictions at Toyota that make it work. And they have a lot of quotes from chairmen of the board there, like, no change is bad. It's all good. We don't care if it makes things fail, breaks things, helps things, or whatever. Our company is built on change as fast as possible, and we just select the ones that work and move them forward, and we reject the ones that fail and move forward. When you ask them, well, how do we work? They say, do you guys build a lot of requirements for a car? And the chairman of the board would say, are you kidding? We know they don't know what the requirements are, and even if they did, when we looked at what they tried to build, they might not be building what is needed. So what we want to see is a working prototype of a car as fast as possible, like maybe 90 days would be good. And then when we look at it, we'll know whether we like it or not, and actually we know we won't like it. That's why we wanted to build it as fast as possible, so we can tell them all the reasons it's broken and then give them the opportunity to fix it. Because when they fix it, we'll tell them the next time all the reasons it's broken again. We'll tell them to fix it again. And after we tell them to fix that thing about 50 times, it'll actually be pretty good. In fact, it'll be a hell of a lot better than any General Motors car, guaranteed, okay? That's just the way we work at Toyota. Fail fast and fix it fast, and do that over and over and over and over. Maybe that's kind of the way Google works, right? Maybe, I don't know. Nobody's talking. What's that?
Ship early, ship off.
Ship early, ship often. It's basic, yeah. Of course, even Toyota screws up. So they've dropped the Consumer Reports. Consumer Reports has downgraded some of their cars now for quality problems. So what do you think that's going to do to Toyota? You think they're going to fail in the market? Probably not. Probably they're going to even try harder, because now they have this failure staring them in the face. They can use that to leverage their success. So one of the interesting ways to look at failures and how they can help is during the last year or so, a venture capital group has asked me to work with them, Open View Venture Partners, and I've even moved my company into their lab where they support all their companies. And so now I'm a coach to all these 20 of their portfolio companies. It's growing rapidly. And so, their goal is a venture capitalist wants one really good company. One Google and 9 failures that's a win for a venture capital company. And they think Scrum might take it to 2 and only 8 failures. That means that their portfolio would be twice any other venture capitalist portfolio gain. That would be hugely successful. And so they've decided that they're only going to invest in Agile projects, and they're only going to invest in market-leading practices. So they asked me, what's the market leader in Agile? I said, well, it's Scrum and XP. So they said, fine, we'll only invest in Scrum and XP. And they said, well, but we want to make sure they're doing Scrum and XP. Well, how do we tell that? Well, one of the things we can do is look at the Nokia test. We can hold management accountable. We need to train the management. If the management doesn't understand how Toyota works, they will never understand Scrum. So we got 50 CEOs and CTOs in a room, and we started talking about this. And we found out that none of those guys understood how Toyota worked. And some of them have MBAs from Harvard Business School. I said, how did you guys get through Harvard Business School without understanding how Toyota works? Because you guys need to know that because you're not going to be able to run your Scrum teams well unless you understand that. Because you have to do things that are contradictory. In order to get more, you have to work less. That's pretty hard for a manager to understand, okay? So we gave them all the Toyota way. We had all the CEOs read the Toyota way. And the senior partner came back to me and he said, these guys don't understand the Toyota way. I'm like, they went to Harvard Business School. They don't understand the Toyota way. Okay, well, what do they understand? Well, they said they understand Taiichi Ohno's Toyota Production System. It's a short book. It's a simple book. It's a really clear book. So he said, fine, we'll train all the management from the Taiichi Ohno book. And now you venture capitalists who are on the board, you're going to hold the managers accountable every board meeting for some of the basic practices at Toyota. Like, how many impediments did you remove for the Scrum team since the last board meeting? And I can tell you that really helps a lot when the senior management's being taken on at the board meeting for this. Does anybody have that experience? Do you have anybody taking your management on at the board level on how many impediments that you're moving at the Scrum? I can tell you the Scrums accelerate a lot faster when that's happening. So it's really a lot of fun. I'd like to spend a little time talking about how we invented Scrum because it's a different kind of thing. It's not your normal process that somebody thought up. We were working in a Smalltalk development environment, building an object-oriented analysis and design tool, and we were going to ship it to our big customers using our legacy products. And a big customer to us, IBM, had sold our products all over the world to places like Ford Motor Company. I had 1,000 people at Ford Motor Company using our legacy products. And we needed a new process for them. And Smalltalk was very different. Do we have any Smalltalkers here? Not very many. There's not too many left anymore. But, we thought Smalltalk was the best software development environment ever built. Many of us who are in that world still believe that. And we're very excited that Smalltalk is coming back. And its name is, do you know what its name is? Ruby. And we love to see things like in the Java user group saying, is Java dead? Big article about how Ruby on Rails is adopting more and more users. But Ruby was developed by a Smalltalk guy, a brilliant Japanese guy, that wanted the purity, the fun, and the capability of Smalltalk in a modern language that could be used for building internet applications. And so Ruby I call Smalltalk's revenge. It's coming back. Well, the guy that invented Smalltalk was a guy named Alan Kay, and he was at Xerox PARC, a research institute in Palo Alto, in the 1980s. And in about 1992, he was invited to MIT to get an award for being one of the inventors of the significant languages. There were 12 of those guys there. John Strustrup was there because of C++, a bunch of other guys. And this was the first slide in Alan's presentation. He said, here's what we did at Xerox PARC in the 1980s. We invented the first personal workstation, the Xerox Star. We invented the first Windows interface and the first use of the mouse in that environment. It's what Steve Jobs saw and then stole for the Macintosh. We invented the Ethernet, the first laser printer, and the first widely deployed object-oriented language. What was the first object-oriented language? Close. It's in Norway. It's not far from your Trondheim group, where I've spent some time there, Google in Trondheim. But it was developed out of a Norwegian research institute. Simula was the name of the language. And, but Smalltalk was the first language that actually took off and became fairly widely used. So I looked at that slide and I thought, Alan didn't leave anything for the rest of us. I mean, what is anybody using other than what's on that slide? Maybe an inkjet printer. That was invented by a friend of mine that lived down the street from Xerox PARC. He was a consultant to Hewlett-Packard, and he created the first inkjet printer. But anyway, the next slide actually kind of got me more excited because Alan said, here's how we invented all this stuff. He said, think of this as a steel plate with grooves in it. And some people, some research labs, maybe most research labs, get in a groove, become highly specialized, and they make small incremental improvements for the whole life of the lab. Companies do that. People do that. And this is a good thing, but we would never have invented any of this stuff at Xerox PARC if we did that. Now, we looked at other labs. They would get in a groove and become highly specialized, and then they'd look over at someone else in another groove, and they would say, gee, you know, this stuff in another business domain, if we brought it together with what we're doing, we could make even bigger leaps in innovation. But Alan said, you know, that would not have done what we needed to do at Xerox. What we did at Xerox was look at extreme data points that were off the plate, impossible data points. The data points that scientists always throw away. You know, I spent 11 years as a professor at a medical school, and I had grants from the National Cancer Institute to do all the analysis and data processing for all these clinical trials and epidemiologic studies. And so we'd work with the clinicians for years, and then they'd get all these data points and draw a line through them. We'd publish it in the New England Journal of Medicine. We got a new drug or a better treatment. The only thing was there were certain data points that were off the line. In fact, they were so far off. They were extreme data points. So lab guys would say, oh, our lab apparatus, it must have been broken that day. That's a bad data point. We'll just throw that data point away, you know, because it's a confusing data point. We can't explain that. We can't put that in the paper. And maybe there was another data point kind of lower, you know, like that patient died on that drug. So but that patient they were a little different than the other patients. We'll just exclude those from the study. There's a lot of that going on out there, I can tell you that, okay? But what Alan said is that these data points are the only data points that are worth spending any time looking at, because the edge of innovation is when you become confused and you can't explain what's going on, and that's where you should go. It's right to that edge of innovation. It's the only spot that it was worth spending 10 minutes at Xerox PARC. So I said, this is interesting. We need a new process for these guys at Ford Motor Company. Let's look at extreme data points and see what it tells us. Well, the first thing we did was we reviewed 30 years of IBM systems journals. We said, IBM must know what the fastest way to develop software is. They've done a lot of research on this, and we found that the surgical team was the best way at IBM to develop software. Has anybody read The Mythical Man Month? A few of you, yeah. There's still people reading that. It's still a classic, as good as the day it was written. Fred Brooks, who ran the IBM 360 operating system, wrote it. He had hundreds of developers, and he learns a lot of painful lessons. And in the middle of that book, there's a chapter on the surgical team. That's a team where one brilliant person has all the architecture, all the design, everything in his or her head, and that person writes every single line of code. It's like the surgeon in the operating room. You know, the surgeon is the only one that cuts the patient. Everybody else passes the scalpel. So we looked at that and we said, definitely that is the performance we want. But we see a problem at Ford with that because we don't think they have any surgeons. And you know, if one of these guys get hit by a bus, the project's over. So it's kind of a high-risk way to build software, and it doesn't scale very well. If you have to build millions of lines of code, I've had one of these teams, and a good surgeon can handle 50,000 lines of code, roughly. That may be worth 500,000 lines of code of anybody else's. But even so, millions of lines needs more than one surgeon. So we said we need to figure out a way to get surgical performance with a team. So we began researching all the computer science literature, talking to everybody, and we found that the best new product development teams were described in a paper by Professor Takeuchi, who was at the Harvard Business School in 1986. It was called the New Product Development Game, and he looked at best teams all over the world, and a couple of them were in the United States at Hewlett-Packard and 3M, but a lot of them were in Japan, particularly consumer products and automobiles. And the way that those teams were described, how they were set up, how they were motivated, how management treated them, Scrum was modeled directly out of that paper. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The problem with that paper is that these weren't software teams, so we looked around for the best software project, and we found that in the Borland QuattroPro project that I mentioned previously. And Bell Labs had gone in there and done an analysis of why that was such a high-performing team, and they found out that it was all about the communication patterns on the team. They had a cross-functional team that met every day for at least an hour, sometimes several hours, and that enabled them to deliver this code at, roughly 40, 50 times the norm in industry. So we said, well, Borland QuattroPro shows us how to get surgical performance. Takeuchi tells us how to set up the team. Let's see if we can do that. And in the very first team that we set up, they went into the hyperproductive state. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about this. My definition of hyperproductive is that the team could deliver so much software that the management, the sales force, the marketing people, and the customers would say, it's too much, it's like drinking from a fire hose, slow down. One of my goals with this was to change the whole development environment. I spent, as I said, many years in a medical school, and I was hired away from the medical school by a big banking organization who was rolling out banking systems all over the United States. They had over 150 banks. And they said, you guys in the medical school, you don't have hardly any money, and you got lots of ideas, but over here at the bank, we have no ideas, but we got all the money that you could ever possibly want. So, this is a great opportunity, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I walk into the bank, and what do I see? I see hundreds of COBOL programmers. And I noticed that their projects were always late. And I thought that was very interesting. When they were late, the management was upset. The customers were upset. Sometimes the bank lost money. And because it was the developer's fault, the management punished them. They had to go on death marches. They had to work overtime. They had to work weekends. They got burnt out. They quit. They got divorced. And I thought, there's something really wrong with this picture. So when we started Scrum, I said, we need to flip this into a team that creates so much software now that we got the management on the run. They've got to figure out a way to sell this stuff, okay? And we were able to do that, and as Scrum went through the pattern language of programming design conferences, and it is a pattern language for hyperproductive software development. And it's published in book 4 of the series on patterns. It's right in there with all the software design patterns in those books. And so Scrum is about not being good, it's about being great. And being great is 5 to 10 times better than the norm out there. And so going from good to great, it means Toyota or better. Now, this is what we see in pretty good Scrums. Revenue's going up, just like, although Google's revenue is starting to level off a little bit, right? But Google's revenue went up like this. And we see companies driving their product into Gartner Group's Magic Quadrant, where they're outperforming on vision and execution. My last company, PatientKeeper, was able to do this in the first couple of years. Drove it right in there. And once you get there, it's just like Google. You can steal people from anywhere. In fact, Google's even stole some people from us recently. But here we are out-competing McKesson, which is the biggest healthcare software company. So anytime we need someone, a good developer, a Scrum Master, a CEO, a Senior VP of Sales, we've stolen them all from McKesson. It's a lot more fun working in an Agile environment, as you guys at Google know. And if you really do that well, our goal, we had a new CEO come in 2003, and he said, you guys talk about a lot about done in Scrum, but the only done that means anything to me is done that generates revenue. The customer's live, the customer's happy, and they're paying money. So why don't we get that done at the end of the sprint? We're live at 4 major hospital systems at least. There are no outstanding issues, and they're paying us. And what do you think the developers said about that? No, that's not exactly what they said. They said, yeah, what are you thinking? That's not possible. But he was a smart guy, and he said, show me your impediment list. Let's work off the top of the impediments. Let's talk about why we can't do that. Well, the install teams are having trouble configuring and installing the software. Well, let's fix that. Well, our quarterly assurance team are having a tough time testing the software. Well, let's fix that. Well, our performance tuning teams are taking too much time to performance tune. Well, let's fix that. It took us until 2005 to be able to deploy at the end of every sprint. And as soon as we hit that, boom, the hockey stick. It really matters getting done. Really matters. Now, to get there, we have to go back to Scrum button, okay? Basfode came up with the first Nokia test in a presentation he did in 2006. I'm going to put it up on my website, so people are asking me, where did this come from? And in that first slide presentation he did, it was all about agility. So it was about agile practices and iterations. And actually in that he said their sprints must be less than 6 weeks. But of course in Scrum we always want them less than 4 weeks. So I've kind of fine-tuned it for Scrum. He said the software features need to be tested and working at the feature level. The acceptance tests, not just the unit tests, need to be done. And the sprints need to start with an Agile specification, just enough, because these guys in the telecom companies, you know, they like these big specs, like hundreds of pages of specs with lots of signatures on them. They want it all done before they start. Okay, that was a big problem at Nokia. So he wanted them to get Agile. So of those of you who are doing Scrum in here, how many of you can pass this part of the Nokia test? About, I would say about half, and that's what we see typically, about half. Then later on, he put on the Scrum development or the Scrum trainers list a modified one that included some Scrum Pack practices, and this one said you need to know who your product owner is. Your product owner has to have a backlog that's prioritized by business value. It needs to be estimated by the team that's going to implement it. The team needs to generate burn down charts in the Scrum so that they know where they are on delivering in the sprint. And they need to know their velocity. How many story points or whatever the measure may be at the end of the sprint can they deliver every sprint? And you can't have anybody disrupting the work of the team. So how many can pass that part of the Nokia test here? We're down to about 10%. Okay. So that's the way it is in the world. And so at the venture group, we want 100% of them to pass the Nokia test. We're really working on that because we need that just to get started. Well, let's talk about some teams. Some of them can pass this test, some of them didn't. That are really hyperproductive teams and scalable teams and distributed teams. And it's very interesting. What we find is that most of these really high-performing teams are running really good engineering practices and often XP practices inside the Scrum. We find that Scrum can't really go hyperproductive. The first team that did Scrum did all the XP practices before XP even existed. In 1995, Ken Beck, who started XP, sent me a famous email asking for everything I had about Scrum. He said, I want to steal everything I can. I'm starting a new process. So Kent focused mainly on the engineering practices. I began working with Ken Schwaber at the time, and he focused mainly on the team process. So they grew up together, and they're very compatible. So the high-performing Scrum teams will often run XP inside, test-driven development, continuous integration, pair programming, those kind of things. And we find that the XP teams have a tough time scaling. It's very hard to globally scale an XP teams or set of teams. You really need to wrap them with Scrum to enable the scaling. So I want to talk about two distributed projects. One is a failed project, and it's a Scrum project, but it is still the most productive large project ever recorded. And a second one is a project that replicated this in a systematic way, ran all the XP practices inside, and got similar results. When I was writing a paper on that first project, we first started thinking about how does Scrum look when it's distributed. You know, you might have 5 teams across the world that don't have any way to communicate other than email or voicemail. Like, that's AdWords. I asked the AdWords team, do we have the AdWords people here? No AdWords people. In Mountain View, I had all the AdWords team in Mountain View there, and I said, well, does the email and voicemail work? You know, it looks like kind of like osmosis. That's the way it works, the communication. They said, yeah, osmosis. I thought, well, maybe Google invented a new way of communication, osmotic communication. Maybe we should introduce that as a standard Scrum practice or something. You know, if it really works, why not? But I asked them if it worked, and they all shook their heads. It was like all in unison. Evidently, there's some communication problems. So if you ask the Scrum Alliance how to do this, they'll say, figure out a way to link those teams. Maybe a Scrum of Scrums by teleconference across geographies that kind of regularly makes sure everything is synced up. But it turns out that that is not the highest performing way. The highest performing way is to actually have all the teams be distributed across geographies. This is tremendously counterintuitive, but I'm going to show you an example. Before I do that, I want to mention something about outsourcing, because our board wanted us to do outsourcing in Patient Keeper for years, and as long as I wasn't outside the company running around, I could prevent it. But then I was out doing Scrum in Europe one time, and the VP of Engineering, who was holding down the fort, agreed to do it. And so we sent a couple $1 million to India to a waterfall team, okay? But he kept careful track of what happened, and he found that at the end of a couple of years, if an Indian waterfall developer cost 10% of an American Scrum developer, that was break even. But they didn't. They cost 30% of an American developer. So he sent $2 million of software over there, and he paid $6 million to get it back. Now, in a venture-funded company, that's a pretty dumb thing to do. And when we showed the board that data, they agreed. It was really stupid. So they stopped all outsourcing. So the lesson in that was, it's not so much India, but it's waterfall. Never outsource to waterfall teams. It always pays to do Scrum locally. If you have to outsource, as Cersei Dynamics did, outsource to a Scrum team. So here's the Cersei Dynamics project, a big library system installed in about 12,500 libraries all over the world, 120 million users in these libraries. And the code base was aging, and they needed to upgrade it into an internet environment. And Jack Blount, who was the CEO of Dynamics, decided to totally re-implement it. So we started in 2002, and you can see the code base is growing. This is thousands of lines of Java code. So after a couple of years, he's up to 170,000 lines of code, and he's saying, okay, at that rate, maybe by 2020, we'll have 1 million lines of code. We'll never make it in the market. We've got to do something. So here he brought in some legacy code and wrapped it with Java and continued along, but still it's the same slope. We're still looking out there beyond 2015. So he said, I've got to do something. He's based in Utah. I don't think I can hire the people I need. I need to go offshore. I need to find some Agile development. So he went to India. He went to China. He went to Russia. And the first thing he noticed was in India and China, the turnover rate was 30 to 35% and increasing. And he decided that he was not going to send his project anywhere where a third of the people working on it quit every year. It's just too disruptive. But he found some stable teams in Russia, And he worked out an arrangement with a company at that time called Starsoft Development Labs, was acquired by a company now called Exigent Services. And on 1 January 2005, they added 25 St. Petersburg developers to 26 Utah developers, and their velocity immediately more than doubled. Now, this is unheard of. It's the first time in the computer literature that anybody has shown that adding people to a large project did not reduce productivity for a developer. The productivity curve looks like this, but this went like that, okay? So this is an extreme data point. This is an unexplainable data point. As soon as I smelled this, I said to the CEO of Starsoft, we need to write a case study. We need to look at why did this happen? So he flew the project leader in Russia into my Boston. We actually met in the middle of a blizzard in my home in the Boston area, and got on the phone to the project leader in Utah, and he went through how the teams were organized. And every team intentionally was set up to be half in Utah and half in Russia. Even if it was a small team, the search team had 4 people, 2 in Russia and 2 in Utah. And it was set up so that any member in any geography could do any task on the sprint backlog. And the cross-geography teams met every day in a Scrum meeting, 15 minutes by teleconference. So in St. Petersburg, it was in the afternoon, late afternoon. In Utah, it was the early morning. They did find that they needed to send out email answering the 3 Scrum questions in order to overcome cultural and language barriers. But with that, they were able to keep these meetings to 15 minutes. They had a central repository for tracking based on the Jira tracking system with a Scrum plugin that they wrote. And they had a dashboard, particularly showed mainly quality data. You'll see some of this data is not very good. They had some quality problems in that project. And at the end of the day, when we did the analysis, I took Mike Cohn's project in his book on user stories, because he has a small waterfall project that he re-implemented with a 6-person Scrum team, a hyperproductive Scrum, running at an order of magnitude better, which is typical in these high-performing Scrum teams. And Suzy Dynamics, in a project, this is only when the Russians were on board, so this was just the periods where the Russians joined the team. Function points per month, which are a measure of features delivered that is comparable across teams and across companies. Cersei Dynamics is doing 15.3, almost the same as a 6-person Scrum co-located in the same room. Now we've got another really extreme, unexplainable data point, because the best data on co-location shows you double the productivity with co-location. Here, it didn't really matter. So another thing to really investigate, why? Well, as I said, there was some problems with Cersei Dynamics. They did do global distributed builds every hour. The global code base was rebuilt every hour, but the builds weren't stable except at sprint boundaries. But even at sprint boundaries, it wasn't potentially shippable code. And they had the Scrum Masters and Product Owners and Architecture only in the US. Actually, that turned out to their advantage because they retained all the knowledge. A side effect of this strategy is you can cut loose the outsourcing people without losing any knowledge. Your velocity just goes down. Whereas if you outsource the knowledge, if you cut off the guys on the other side of the planet, all of a sudden half your brain is lost. Okay, so this approach has some really unique features. They weren't running the same in Utah as in Russia. Utah was not doing XP. They didn't have any face-to-face meetings between the Russians and Utah. Low test coverage, poor refactoring practice, didn't have equal talent across teams. That's one of the things people said, oh, you know, those Russians, they're so much better than those Utah developers. That's why, you know, they did so well. Well, it turns out they did do performance analysis across teams as if they were one team. And it is true the Russians were in the top 15 percentile. Every one of the Russians was in the top 15 percentile. So they were on the average better. That's why they more than doubled productivity, okay, when they went out. And at the end of the day, the company killed the project anyway. So it's a failed project. So from the point of view of a research study, what does this mean? You know, it was a single data point from a retrospective study. The study had already happened, and then we looked at it and noticed something interesting. In medicine, they say that doesn't prove anything. It could be just chance. You can't infer causality. Was Cersei Dynamics a lucky accident? Or maybe an unlucky accident? They killed the project. Well, I had some other data from the Starsoft labs. Here's the last 24 C# projects. This is lines of code in terms of size of project, and this is function points per person month. All of them are more productive than Cersei Dynamics. They're all hyperproductive. The whole company's gone into a hyperproductive state. So maybe there's something here. We really need to dig into this further. Now, a lot of people say, well, what does velocity mean anyway? You know, they could be going fast, but they could be delivering stuff that doesn't have real value. They could just be pumping out crappy software. But I say, you know, working with the venture guys, we got to have velocity. It doesn't matter how good you are if you're slow. You can't make any money off of that. And if you're slow, no matter how good you are, it's very hard to fix slow. It's just hard to change. But if you're fast, then there's some hope. We can start introducing best practices to drive your quality up. And maybe you make even a fast velocity go faster. Now we've got some leverage. So velocity matters in my book. And it's easier to fix quality than it is to get hyperproductive. So Cersei Dynamics has some interesting data. Some of the other projects there show some interesting numbers. We should do a careful study. We should do a prospective study. We should set up teams with the expectation that we can completely distribute teams and we can replicate local velocity at a distance. And we should do it for multiple teams, and we should carefully control quality, just like we do in a clinical trial. And let's see if this really works. We can actually get distributed velocity equal to co-located velocity. So a company in the Netherlands looked at this and they said, we're going to try this and see if it works. So they defined the distributed team model. They ensured a consistent talent across geographies, established high-quality data gathering, ran consistent models, and the goal is local velocity equals distributed velocity, local quality equals distributed quality, and scaling is linear at constant velocity for developers. That's what we want to demonstrate through a series of pilot projects. Now, one of the things that Jim Copeland says is, Jeff, you can't have a distributed team. A team can't exist distributed. A team that is functioning as one unit breaks down across geographies. And so I began going through the research literature on that, and in general, that is true. At least 80% and probably over 90% of distributed teams are not a team. They're multiple sub-teams with different agendas. Trust breaks down, they compete. It's not a team. But it turns out that, you know, if you look at the emergency response team literature, in rare teams, a larger team identity is formed, where the team rises to a higher level conceptually, and everybody's driving towards the same goal. So the question is, if you're going to do distributed teams, How do you capture that? It doesn't happen by chance. So what Zebia did beginning a couple of years ago is they said, okay, we have a subsidiary in India. Let's start a project, and we'll have typically run with teams of 8. They do pair programming, so they want pairs. So we'll start with 4 Dutch guys in the Netherlands, and we'll bring 4 guys from India to the Netherlands, and we'll run locally as a team, face-to-face. We'll run several sprints, and we'll establish a local velocity. Then we'll move the Indian half of the team back to India. They'll still run as the same team, meeting every day in the Scrum meeting, and we'll see if we can keep the same velocity. And one of the examples in a paper, and this is going to be published at the Agile conference in Toronto in a couple of weeks, is what they call the ProRail project. This is the scheduling system for the Netherlands railway system. Does all this, runs all the signs on the railroad, does all the scheduling. And Zebia was hired. Those scheduling systems for railways are hard to build, okay? And a waterfall team, maybe even multiple teams, had already failed and been thrown off the project. Zebia was hired in, and they initially put an 8-person Dutch team on the project and got a local velocity established. They then got 8 people from India to come, and then they formed 2 teams, each team half Dutch, half Indian, still running local velocity. And they established a velocity that was running at 5 times the speed of there were many other vendors on this big project, and they know they're running at 5 times the velocity of any of the other vendors. They then sent the Indians back to India. They run all of the XP practices inside the Scrum. The definition of done at the end of the sprint is the customer has done complete acceptance testing on the customer site and declared the software ready for deployment. Okay, so a strong definition of done. And defects rate are less than 1 per 1,000, 1 per 1,000 lines of code, which are pretty low, some of the lowest in the industry. And they're steadily getting lower as the code base grows. The bug count is actually, the open bugs are actually going down, so the defect rate is getting better and better. Here's a graph of the defect rate. These are all the bugs that have been opened, and the purple are closed, and the only ones remaining is the gold line. So you can see the defect rate is going down as the code base increases, so the defect rate decreases. They can't get every single defect found in an iteration eliminated, but over 90% of them are within the iteration. They do test-driven development, pair programming, continuous integration. One of the things they say is they try to get exactly the same team conditions in India and Netherlands. That means the same tools, the same environment, the same level of talent, the same capabilities. They want the team uniform throughout. The Indians say that it feels exactly the same as India as it does in Amsterdam. They work exactly the same no matter whether they're in Amsterdam or India. And another interesting finding of this is that the Zebia CTO has found that the distributed team is better than the local team. The reason being, there is no difference in quality and velocity, and cost is somewhat less. But the reason that they're better is the Dutch guys explain to the Indian guys every day what the customer's thinking, and it keeps the whole team more customer focused. When they have all the guys in the Netherlands being Dutch, they tend to drift off customer focus. So his decision is that all projects will run this way. It's just a better way to do it. Now, how crazy is that? Now, just to show you how they resolve cultural differences, there are cultural differences. One of the teams had a local velocity decrease after distribution. The Indians went back to India and the velocity went down. So they immediately did an analysis of why, and they found that the guys on the Indian side were waiting for the Indian technical leader to tell them what to do, which is counter Scrum. It cuts velocity. So the same day they realized that, they said, okay, the Scrum Master is now the technical lead in India. The top of the impediment list is velocity. Fixed it. In less than a week, boom, it's back to where it was locally. So here's some data that shows this is the number of story points locally. They were local here, and then here they split. And so story points are only going up. Here's the velocity. I think this is the price in euros, or actually it's hours here, but they measure the cost in euros per story point. And it was at around iteration 7 that they distributed. So it popped up slightly, then went down. So roughly the same. Here it started to go up. And when they started to do an analysis of why the cost went up, they found that the team was going faster. But in going faster, they were creating more bugs, and the rework was driving cost up. So they actually slowed the teams down, and the cost is coming right back down to where they want it. So you have to be careful about going too fast. So the net effect of the Zebia product, this is a little bit smaller than Cersei Dynamics, is they got 15.1 function points per development month, and Cersei Dynamics got 15.3. But this is a rigorous implementation with very high quality. So I think it demonstrates well that this was not a lucky accident. It's repeatable. Now, if this were a clinical trial in medicine, we would say now other clinical trials have to repeat the same result. So now we're looking for other companies to try this. Maybe Google would want to try this. But you have to run a really good Scrum to do this. Now, it's fascinating. Capers-Jones, who's one of the leading productivity guys in the United States, which has written dozens of books on this, sent me some data recently showing his analysis of many projects. He has special tools that make teams comparable. It adjusts automatically, mathematically for different environments and all that. He says if you look at function points per month for a CMM level 3 company, on the average for a small project, this is a very small project, so this is high. Okay, it's not 2, it's 8. The Agile teams are twice as good, and these are not even necessarily Scrum teams. There's probably a lot of Scrum butt in there, but in general, they're twice as good. The thing that struck me was 15.1 came up again. 15.1 is kind of looking like the magic number. So at the end of the day, both Cersei Dynamics and Zebia are getting, and Systematic Software Engineering in Denmark, who is a CM Level 5 company, they see the same results. As teams scale, and if you run a really good Scrum, you get linear scalability in contrast to the typical waterfall project. So at the end of the day, Cersei Dynamics was the first implementation. They didn't have any administrative costs in the function point analysis. Zebia does, so it's a fully burdened cost. They had a lot of quality issues that I talked about. Zebia fixed all that. Fully distributed team, replicated across many projects, included all administrative overhead. Continuous integration of working build. They do test-driven development. So all the unit tests are done before coding, constant refactoring, fully automated daily regression and performance testing, and acceptance tests by the customer at the end of a sprint. Now, it's interesting what Zebia is doing now. I was recently at a session. Every month I spend a week at OpenView Venture Partners coaching the OpenView teams because the venture group runs its whole operation by Scrum. They have 3 Scrums. The senior partners that do the investment are a Scrum. They have a search team that does a global search for the best companies in the world and selects the companies for potential investment. They run a Scrum. And the OpenView Labs, which runs all the support for all the portfolio company investments. And At a recent session, Scott Maxwell, who's the senior partner, jumped up and he said, Jeff, I want to show you the Maxwell curve. He said, you know, as venture capitalists, we want to get people really productive. And to do that, we want them to work really hard. You know, we know if they work 0 hours a week, they get 0 done. So we want to drive them harder and harder and harder until they start to break down and burn out, okay? And so our idea of a work week is that's always 40 hours a week. And the people in his venture group, you know, they're working 60 hours a week before I came in there. And he said, but you know, Scrum is different. Scrum requires an intensity that you can't keep up. And what we really want is to get twice as much done using that intensity. And in order to do that, we need to work less. So now all the guys that are working 40 hours a week, they're getting more done and feeling guilty for not working hard enough. We had a long discussion about that. But the question is, are they working too much even at 40 hours? We have data from a XP team or a set of teams where a manager decided that he would run a study to see what was the right work length for XP teams doing intense pair programming. He tried 40-hour weeks, 50, 60, 30, 20. What do you think was the most productive work week? 20 is close, 16 hours. So Zeeby is saying, you know, maybe our cost per story point is too high because they're working 40-hour weeks. We're going to start sending these guys home early and see if the cost per story point goes down, meaning the velocity is going up. So when you run a really good Scrum with that kind of data collection, you can start doing these things. Why not have more fun if you can get more done, right? So the recommendations out of all this is you can execute pretty good Scrum. Why not execute great Scrum? Why not give this a try? Now to do it, you need to be able to carefully set up those teams. You need to be able to measure the velocity carefully because you want to know if you're breaking down as you distribute the teams. You might want to measure cost per story point, and increasing cost will show you something's breaking down or quality is causing rework. And the lesson in all this is if you can carefully measure results, you can very quickly correct problems. Those who can't suffer eternal dysfunction. You know, the companies that are doing Scrum are kind of in 3 categories. There's those companies that don't want to hear about their impediments. They don't want to hear about what's wrong. And so if Scrum is in there, they suppress the Scrum Master's, surfacing of the impediments and prevent process improvement. At the venture group, we say these companies deserve to die, and the faster the better. And we have companies that are coming up and are going to take some of their business for them and help. Then we have a second group of companies, and they're the companies that will talk about their impediments but won't fix their impediments. And there's a lot of them. These companies are in purgatory. They're an internal struggle. And if you were raised as a good Catholic, you know that people deserve to be in purgatory for their sins, and they deserve to suffer long enough to learn better. So these companies deserve to suffer. It's okay. Scrum coaches are worried about that. Geez, what do I do? I'm working away, and the management doesn't want to fix impediments, and if I raise too much noise, I might get fired. And it's just okay. They deserve to suffer. You're like the Buddha working in, there's a Buddha that works in hell. His name is the Shitty Buddha. Spends his entire time trying to coach those people down there. It's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. But then there are the companies that will look at their impediments and they will fix them. And those companies start to accelerate and grow really fast. And they avoid eternal dysfunction. So this slide means, don't try this at home. This is for this is for professional teams that are really highly disciplined that we're talking about. But it's a really interesting model that I think we're going to see more of. And certainly Exigent Services now has a strategy of trying to use agility worldwide. They are a couple of thousand, they're not huge, but a couple of thousand consultants is enough to cause some significant trouble and disrupt the market for pretty big consulting projects. And their strategy is to use agility to do that. And we'll be talking about that at the Agile conference in 2 weeks. So those are my comments tonight. I think we have some time for some questions, some discussions, some thoughts about this. Usually people are kind of quiet after these data. Yeah. Well, what is an effective work day? Now, in some of the, I have a company that I've worked with a little bit in Charlotte, where Joe Little, who's with me, comes from. And they had a team of 9 people, and they thought that, they were doing 60, their velocity was 60 story points a sprint. I think they were running 2-week sprints, and they thought, 9 was a little big. Maybe if they made them smaller, they'd go faster. So they broke them into 5 and 4. And within 3 sprints, they were doing 180 story points. They tripled their velocity. And so I was back there 6 months later since we had discussed this, and I said, well, how's it going now, Jason? He said, the 5-person team, 2 people quit, and then we got into some dynamics. We lost that entire 5-person team. And I said, what's your velocity now? And he said, it's the same as it was when we had 9 people. So now we got 4 people doing the work of 9 people that had already tripled what they were doing earlier. So he's multiplied it by 6 times. And it was already pretty good Scrum to begin with. And I said, well, what kind of problems do you have now? He says, well, I'm getting a lot of flack for the management because I tell the people to come in, work hard, and as soon as you feel tired, just take off. So that's probably the answer to your question. Come in, put out a good effort, and when you start to, feel a little burnout, just go surfing or something. At Trondheim, they tell me that their focus factor, well, what's your focus factor here in the New York office? They know it in Trondheim. Nobody's answering. It means you don't know your focus factor. Okay, it's really good to know your focus factor. Trondheim, it's 50%. What's your focus factor? When you come in the day, how many hours do you really get focused on burning that backlog down? So any meetings, any emails, all that stuff, it doesn't count. Only when you're coding on that backlog. So what's your focus factor? Yeah. So, figuring out what the right focus factor is, it probably varies across individuals. I always had the attitude, if we had a guy that come in and worked an hour or 2 and he did more than most people worked in 8 hours, then an hour and 2 is plenty. That's fine. I've always had people that have like that have worked for me. I've always encouraged them to work their own schedule, whatever it is. I don't care. Yeah, there were a lot of other hands up earlier. What else?
Yeah, I work in a consulting company, and there's 150 consultants. 4 of us are software developers. And so the minimum expectation is 50 hours a week for a consultant. Most of them are 60, 70, 80 hours a week. Yeah. Any recommendations in that kind of environment, how to survive as a consultant? And I would even take like some extreme things in terms of making large moves to try to change the relationship of software developers.
Right. So there's 4 software developers in a consulting company of 150, and everybody works 60, 70, 80 hours a week. How can they survive and not work 60 or 70 hours a week, which you're working? What's your focus factor?
I never measured it, so.
What would you guess it would be?
I'd say 30%.
30%. No, you ought to get rid of some of those hours at least. If you bump your focus factor to 50%, you can cut a huge chunk of those hours. You can probably go to 40 hours a week with a focus factor of 50% and get at least as much done.
Well, the problem is they make money charging per hour. So there's very little incentive.
Well, this is a problem. You know, why would customers pay per hour for something that, you know, any customer, you know, they just don't know what they're doing. You know, I mean, they just don't understand. But if they read the literature, they'd know the difference between the best and the worst developer is 1 to 10 within a project. This is the Yale University data, and 1 to 25 across the project. So now I'm going to pay you for 10 hours of work. But does that mean I'm going to get, are you going to do that work in half an hour? Or is it actually going to cost you 2.5 times as much and you're going to bill me 25 hours? When all I want is a feature, I mean, it's just crazy. They should pay for feature. And in fixed price contracts, they do that. And we spent a lot of time today in the training class we did talking about how to work fixed price contracts, a consultancy, and fixed price contracts. You can drive your margins from whatever they are today, usually 15 to 20% is good. You can drive that to 50 to 80%. Because if you drive your velocity, if you pull a Scrum thing where you drive your velocity up 5 to 10, and you get paid the same rate as the waterfall guys get paid for hours, well, guess what? You get paid for 10 times as many hours. So you get money for nothing. Then you can go home early and still make twice as much money. So I would say your consultant is not thinking clearly yet. Okay? They're body shopping when they could be making real money. So that's another whole issue, that strategy, your strategy of your company really needs a serious look, because you are leaving a ton of money on the table if you're doing Scrum. A ton of money. Yeah.
But that's assuming that you can estimate in advance. For instance, let's take a really large project as an example. And I think most of us that do incremental delivery and iterative development realize that the best way to do a project is actually to break it up into chunks and estimate, you know, a valuable chunk at a time. Makes perfect sense. And the challenge with, you know, consultancies, but I work for one as well, so it's the same type of challenge, is many times when talking fixed price projects, the clients demand estimate much larger chunks than we actually think is good business practice.
Right.
So it's that dilemma that actually drives the hourly rate that is.
Well, the thing is, if you can deliver in half the time of any of your competitors, and you know that, and you can get a business model that allows you to compete and drive your margins up to 2, 3, 4 times your competitors, even though it's maybe a broken business model to estimate such big chunks, why wouldn't you do it? Because right now, you're just, you know, getting your 15% margin on the number of hours your guys put in. Why don't you get 80% margin? And that's all I'm saying.
Right.
And it's possible. And there's a lot of different strategies. A number of the companies I work with in Scandinavia are very aggressive about this. And they use it in all kinds of different ways. Like the CEO of one company recently told me he was going in on a €5 million project, and he knew all the competitors were going to bid €5 million, and they were lowballing it, and they were not going to be making any money, and they were going to make it up in cost overruns. But he knew he could bid €5 million, and he was almost guaranteed he could nail that number in terms of cost and make some margin. So he was going to take that project right off the table of the other vendors. Another company, Systematic Software Engineering, is CMM Level 5 company. Now, those guys can estimate pretty well. They have to have very low margins of error to get rated. With Scrum, within 6 months, just beginning Scrum, they found that they could deliver a project at half the cost with Scrum and 40% fewer defects. So they started bidding on these big projects. They said, you can have the waterfall project, that's 10 million euro, but we'll give you the Scrum project for 5 million. They're both CMM level 5. The only difference is the Scrum project has 40% fewer bugs. That's just the way it is. We measured it on dozens of projects. It always comes out that way. And so I was there in 2006, and they were 100% waterfall. And I was there in the summer of 2007, and I couldn't find a waterfall project in the company. I said, what happened? I know the European Union on their big government projects, they require waterfall. And they said, well, somehow waterfall just faded away. They said, well, I guess at half the price and half the bugs, even a bureaucrat can figure out what they're going to buy. But I actually dug into this, and I found out they only require waterfall above a certain amount of money. So the bureaucrats were chunking it into smaller chunks, which is perfect for an Agile team. And then they could do Scrum, and they could get it done for half the price and half the bugs. So it's amazing what happens. Yeah, back.
Yeah, I actually work at a company where we do Agile development, and we have lots of different teams. We have 2 teams in Poland and London. We have our main team in New York, and then we have a team in Dallas and an outsourcing team in Paris. And in my experience, I get a lot more work done with people that are plus or minus 1 hour in terms of the time zone difference than with people who are up. Well, I'm really surprised that the Utah and Russia team did so well with such a big time difference. Has there been anything?
Yeah, the comment is, a 1 hour time difference gets a lot more done than a lot more hour time difference. And typically that is definitely true. People working in the same room, as I said, there was the best study I've seen on co-location. A company randomly co-located some teams. They were, roughly comparable teams, so they took a bunch of them and co-located them. The rest they left dispersed and within the company. And the co-located teams delivered twice as much stuff. So that's normal. So I would say that effect would play out in time zones well. So that's the normal situation. What I'm talking about here is an abnormal situation. It's an extreme data point. But from a venture point of view, you're always looking at something that's different, that cuts through to go where people haven't been able to go before. And all I'm saying is that this is a strategy that people have been able to use to do that. Maybe back here, yeah.
I work for a web startup. We have a kind of 6-person team with myself. I would say we fit into the 10% of pretty hardcore Scrum execution. We've got we do 1-week iterations of velocity. We've laid out our feature backlog and goes into like middle of next year. And our management wants to go faster.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've been challenged to do is to basically say, okay, what are our options for growth and how much would different options cost? I did a bunch of research to try to figure out, based on the demand months, related studies, what does that curve look like as you expand a team and put your first down like 0 data. I was wondering if you had any ideas or guidance on how to approach modeling.
Well, the rule of thumb we use for Scrum teams is if you go to more than 1, your velocity doesn't double. 1.4 is more likely. So you're going to take a big hit. Unless you do what Zebia does. And that is very carefully set up a strategy that works. A Systematic has done the same thing, demonstrated linear scalability, so is Starsoft Labs. But it sounds like you have good Scrum teams running XP inside. You should be able to figure out how to do this. It just has to be done very carefully, and you have to be able to measure it all the way. Now, as far as your management improving velocity, one way is to expand the teams and do it in the best way possible, but another way is to remove impediments. No matter how fast you're going, people have already has always been able to go faster just by figuring out a better way to do it. So that's another thing to really think about. Is your management really on board? Do they understand Scrum? Are they systematically getting things out of your way and all that stuff? Probably as a startup, you're probably in pretty good shape about that.
Yeah, we're all
Crammed in the same room, that helps, yeah. Yeah.
I totally buy that that data which you provide. That can be really comparable to what collocated team does, performance does. Now, I've seen that data in my own experience. It's not as good as what you demonstrated to us. My question actually lies in a different area, and that is, okay, probably these results were driven by really well thought Scrum Master or organization of how the process works. So my interest is actually, are you planning to release the practices which were used to allow these teams to be so successful to implement Scrum? Like for example, you mentioned that they use the technique in the Russian environment to attack the cultural and language differences by sending emails before the Scrum. And I think that's wonderful. Because I've heard people who cannot speak, but they really can write well, and you will understand better if you have it on paper.
Right.
So I never thought of it when the day was Scrum. I try to use it if I run integration. But
there are other things, both in the Cersei Dynamics paper and in the Zebia paper, which is available. You know, if you send me an email, I can send you the paper. Probably Joe will be sending it out to the people that are meeting with us this week anyway. But as many things as we can think of that were important, we put in that paper. Now, there's nothing that's going to substitute from having the kind of culture in the company that Zebia has. The consultants are all aggressive, enthusiastic. You know, they're ready to go out and really kick some butt. They're a high-performance team, like a good sports team. And so to do what they did, you have to have that, you know, build that team spirit in the organization. Yeah.
Things that I found interesting in the example of the Dutch and the Indian team, you said the product owners and the architects were on site, whereas the developers were at the offshore, and having the Scrum Master offshore really worked for that team. What would you suggest in a situation wherein you have the development team itself distributed across several geographies? How do you encourage peer programming in a situation like that when you have one person in Toronto, one person in Chicago, one person in India, you know, development team?
If you have one person in each of many locations, I suppose it would be, I mean, the technology today, you probably do pair programming because you can use go to my PC and come right into somebody else's screen. There's probably a way to do that and work together, but obviously it's more difficult. You don't have to do pair programming. One of the best teams I had at IDX, which is now GE Healthcare, was a team that had a third of the people in Burlington, Vermont, a third in Boston, a third in Seattle. And the Seattle people all work from home. And that was one of the most high-performing scrums I'd ever seen. It was like one of these Zebia teams. But they had a scrum master, you know, talented people on the team, and a scrum master that was really a great scrum master, one of the best I'd ever seen. And he was able to power up that team and keep them focused in a way that really helped. And, you know, every day that distributed team meeting really worked. So if you have a scrum that doesn't work very well locally and you distribute it, it is even more of a mess when it's distributed. So you have to have a really good local capability, and you have to have really disciplined performance remotely to make it, the kind of things I'm talking about work. Yeah. Amy?
So I would say that the teams that I'm working with, they're high-performing Scrum teams. But one of my observations is we can't seem to get away from that end of the sprint punch line. Even if it's a 4-week sprint or a 2-week sprint, it kind of feels like the sprint review is coming and there's that psychological, end of the sprint, and a perception is the velocity is going up towards the end of the sprint. Does that mean that we're not high performing Scrum team as we think we are, or is that something that's kind of natural tendency?
Well, what was noticed on the AdWords project when Scrum was first starting to be implemented by Mark Strybeck was that developers that didn't understand that a lot of work in progress, a lot of open items in the middle of the sprint was going to cause big problems at the end, cause the date to tend to slide out. So it creates a lot of desperate measures at the end. But if the development team will focus on finishing the first story first and testing it immediately, and then go to the next story, that means everybody has to work together all the time to get these stories done sequentially and test it right away. When you get to the end of the sprint, you only have that last story to finish and test. And that's the way Patient Keeper works, because when we go live at the end of the sprint, we can't afford to have a crisis at the end, or things could really blow up. I mean, if we, so what you see in those teams is the backlog, it'll be slow. It'll actually go up in the beginning because we enter the sprint with a lot of risk, and tasks are starting to explode a little bit. So the sprint will go up, but then it'll go, whoom, they'll burn down actually an ideal day per developer in the middle of that sprint. And then they'll, a week before the end, they're coasting in. So they got a nice coast in that last week where people aren't really pressured. They do that by testing things immediately as soon as they're done. So the testing is going on all the time, and they're surfacing any integration problems or any cross, team problems right away. So my guess is that focus would help the Google teams based on the data I've seen from the AdWords project. In environment, you eliminate it. Why? Because it makes quality go down and it cripples velocity. So that's what Mark tried to teach the AdWords team, to try to measure the burn down of tasks, but measure the burn down of completed stories as well. And if the gap starts to widen between completed stories and tasks done, immediate problem. If you keep both of those running right together, you'll come into the end much better. You'd think that really smart people would figure out how Toyota works and actually incorporate it into their practice, wouldn't you? If you're really smart, you would figure that out. And then you'd operate accordingly. Yeah. Another one over here. Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed working with some good teams, seems to be contrary to some of the kind of Scrum, but curious about your reaction. First is that in a 1-week iteration, a burn down is not that easy for that chart. And then the second piece was the more high performing the team, the less necessary Scrum Master. Any thoughts on, have you seen that true, or
the second one, the more high performing the team, the less, I wouldn't say the less important the Scrum Master is, but the less the Scrum Master need to do. This is definitely true. One of the things that is really interesting, and I'm doing a lot of work with the Agile coach at MySpace now. We're trying to do a bunch of Scrum training in LA. And MySpace has a company, about a third of it is waterfall. Another third of it is Scrum, but they have a lot of project leaders in there. There's a lot of kind of conflict and churn because of the project leaders in Scrum. And another third runs pretty good Scrum. And the Agile coach there is very good at taking Scrum teams and taking them hyper-productive. And he does it using a change in behavior as the team evolves. So he takes on a new team and he says, okay, we're going to do Scrum, we're going to do it by the book, we're going to burn everything down, we're going to do stories in order, we're going to test them right away, There's going to be no argument about this for the first 2-week sprint. That is the way it's going to be. I know you're going to hate me, but I need to teach you how it actually works. You actually have to do it at least once so you know what it is. Okay? So they all hate him for 2 weeks. The next 2 weeks, if they're actually successful, if they're not, then they have to suffer for another 2 weeks. Let's say they're successful that 2 weeks, then he lightens up. He moves more into a facilitator. And then they start to kind of like him. So he might run a sprint or two as a facilitator, and then in coaching them, he will get a number of them, not just one, but repeatedly, he will get teams to pop into a hyperproductive state where they're in that 5 to 10 times normal range from the waterfall teams at MySpace. And then he will back off and just let it run. And if it stays that way, he will then leave it and then go grab another team. So there's a patterning of behavior. If the velocity is 10% of what it could be, which is where waterfall teams are, 10% of their ultimate potential, you have to have command and control to pop them out of that state. Once they start to come up in velocity, by doing it right, you back off and move into what we call the standard Scrum mode, which is a Scrum Master as a facilitator. Now, if you're a really good facilitator, you actually coach them into a really high-performing state where you can do nothing. So the best Scrum Master has nothing to do all day. Those are the best Scrum Masters. What's that?
That explains a lot of things.
I just want to point out that you can't use the associative property then. Like the best Scrum Master might not have anything to do all day, but just because a Scrum Master isn't doing anything all day doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best Scrum Master. I'm just making sure the Scrum Masters in the room know that.
There's two types of Scrum Masters that are not doing anything all day. Ones that have teams whose velocity sucks, and the others have teams whose velocity is 10 times normal. As long as they have teams 10 times normal and they can consistently produce them, then you want them to work some of the time getting the team there, but not bother them the rest of the time, because they're actually your golden goose. They're laying these golden eggs for you. Okay. So what actually happens is a good Scrum Master like this will do what the guy at MySpace does. Well, he'll keep on just taking new teams and then take them up the track. Or in Google's case, in Mark Schreiber's case, I think it was your VP of Engineering, said, Mark, we've got a bigger problem than AdWords. Now that you've got AdWords working, then we've got a quality problem in Google. Is that what he's doing now, is working the testing and quality side of Google? So a really good Scrum Master usually gets promoted, and often several levels, into bigger and bigger. That's why a good Scrum Master is really hard to find. They get promoted so fast you can never get them back again.
Another question. So I've read, and I don't want to misquote you, I apologize if I do, but I've read a little bit about some of your dialogues about how things work at Patient Keeper. And it's always described very much like essentially the entire company is aligned towards Scrum. It's not just software development, it's product development, it's sales, it's support, it's everything, right?
Right.
In these examples where you were looking at these extreme data points, like did you look into that at all? Like, was this just software development teams doing Scrum, or was it more of that entire company alignment?
Well, this is really important. The entire company alignment and the management really on board is essential to these high-performing teams. I haven't seen anything like what I'm talking about without the management being totally on board and understanding what's going on, because it's so easy. I mean, send a GM manager into a Toyota plant. What do you think is going to happen? Things are going to get messed up within a few weeks because they just don't understand. And so management, unless they get on board, they understand Scrum. I have companies that the CEOs come to the training. I have one company in Denmark where every single person, the secretary that's answering the phone, goes to Scrum training, certified Scrum Master training. So the entire company is certified Scrum Masters. When they started to do that, their revenue and growth did a hockey stick. Within a year from that decision, they acquired 2 more companies and went public. So it's critical. And that's in working with the venture capital group, they all understand management is really important. We actually start there with those companies and get the management really primed, and then kind of they help bring the development teams along. Okay, how are we doing on time, Amy? We're overtime. Maybe one burning question, if anybody has one. If not, thank you all for coming tonight. Really enjoyed being here.